The chalk screeched across the blackboard like nails dragged over glass, a shrill, grating sound that set teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of every student's neck rise. Professor Robert Miller's hand flew across the slate with manic energy, his knuckles chalk-stained, his cuffs smudged in white dust. The equations spilled out of him like a fever, each symbol twisting into the next until the board was no longer a surface but a battlefield, scarred and crowded with lines, fractions, and symbols stacked in desperate layers. What he wrote seemed less like mathematics and more like a storm breaking loose, a language only he could speak. The lecture hall, once cavernous and grand, seemed to shrink with every stroke. The walls pressed inward, the air thick with chalk particles that clung to throats and made every breath a chore. Miller's voice rose above it all, booming and relentless, as though he were not a teacher but a prophet, standing on a pulpit of numbers, demanding obedience from disciples too weary to follow. Emily pressed her fingers against her temple, the beginnings of a headache pounding behind her eyes. The rows of fractions and exponents blurred into shapes that looked more like hieroglyphs than equations, as if the professor had transported them into some forgotten temple where math was a ritual and they were unwilling participants. Jason, seated 2 rows down, gripped his pencil so tightly his knuckles whitened. And then, snap. The pencil broke cleanly in half, the crack echoing in the room with a finality that felt like judgment. He tossed the pieces aside, defeated. Mark exhaled so forcefully that his breath fogged his glasses, leaving smudges that only deepened his helplessness. He wiped at them clumsily, muttering under his breath, as though clarity of vision might somehow unlock clarity of thought. Meanwhile, Sophia sat frozen, her pen hovering uselessly over a blank page. She stared at the board with hollow eyes, her lips parted as though she might whisper an answer, but nothing came. Her silence said what they all felt: paralysis, the usual murmur of shuffling notebooks, whispers of explanation, and the creak of old wooden seats was gone. The room had become an oppressive tomb, filled only with the professor's furious dictation and the occasional sigh of despair. The fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered, their hum mocking the silence, casting a sickly glow that made every shadow seem deeper. The smell of chalk dust hung thick, mixing with the faint, sour tang of coffee that had long gone cold. Miller's voice thundered now, reverberating through the hall. This is the essence of higher mathematics. Beautiful, elegant, precise, and his fist struck the board for emphasis, leaving a cloud of chalk that drifted like smoke after a gunshot. But his audience did not see beauty or elegance. They saw an impenetrable wall, a fortress built of symbols with no door, no window, no light, the weight of failure pressed down like an invisible hand, heavy and suffocating, pages crumpled under frustrated palms, pens dragged angrily across paper only to leave smears of ink. Aborted attempts at logic. Hope withered in silence. One by one. The students' shoulders slumped, their eyes dulled, and the same unspoken thought began to creep into every mind like a slow poison. What if this is beyond us? What if no one here can solve it? And in that suffocating moment, amid broken pencils, fogged glasses, and shattered confidence, the lecture hall was no longer just a place of learning. It had become a theater, and the drama was only just beginning. Jason's elbow struck the edge of his desk with a dull thud. The plastic cup tipped in slow motion, a wave of orange liquid spilling out, cascading across the floor like a miniature flood. The sharp scent of citrus cut through the chalk dust in the air. The students gasped, a few scrambling to lift their notes out of harm's way. "Seriously, Jason?" Emily hissed, yanking her notebook back just as the juice crept toward her shoes. Jason muttered a curse, his face burning red. The spill wasn't catastrophic, but in the tense silence of the lecture hall, it sounded louder than thunder. Professor Miller stopped mid-equation, his chalk frozen against the board, his brows furrowed. He wasn't angry, just irritated at the disruption, like a maestro interrupted mid-symphony. A phone call was made. A few moments later, the door creaked open. She entered quietly, almost invisibly at first, as if the scene had been waiting for her all along. Anna Thompson, the janitor, the one no one paid attention to. Middle-aged, in a plain navy uniform, her hair tied back in a simple bun, she carried a mop and a rag, tools of invisibility, instruments of the unnoticed. No one expected her to matter. She was background. She was silence in a room full of voices. And yet, there she was. Her steps were unhurried, soft against the linoleum floor. The mop swished gently as she approached the spill. The students barely looked at her. They were too embarrassed for Jason, too anxious about the unsolved equation still glowing on the board. Anna crouched down, pressing her rag against the spreading puddle. Methodical, almost graceful, but then it happened. Her eyes lifted, just for a second. From her angle on the floor, the blackboard loomed above her like a mural of chaos. Rows of chalk symbols layered over one another, dense and suffocating. For the students, it was torment. For Professor Miller, it was beauty. But for Anna, something else entirely. Her gaze sharpened. She tilted her head, as if listening to music only she could hear. The symbols weren't chaos. They were rhythm. They were patterns. The problem that strangled an entire room of bright students suddenly unfolded in her mind with startling clarity. She froze. Rag in hand, the last streak of orange juice half wiped, and then without meaning to, the words slipped from her lips. I know the solution. It was quiet, almost accidental, but in the deathly silence of that classroom, it landed like a gunshot. Heads turned. Emily's pen clattered to the desk. Jason blinked, as if he'd misheard. Mark muttered, "What did she just say?" Sophia's jaw dropped, and at the front of the room, Professor Robert Miller slowly turned, chalk still in hand, his expression unreadable, for a heartbeat. The world hung suspended between disbelief and curiosity. Anna's cheeks flushed. She hadn't meant to speak aloud. She was a janitor, not a student, not a mathematician. She was supposed to mop floors, not challenge the intellect of a world-renowned professor, but the words were out, and she couldn't take them back. Professor Miller stepped forward, his shoes clicking sharply against the tile. His eyes narrowed, not in mockery, but in intrigue. He studied her face the way he studied equations, intensely, searching for truth hidden beneath the surface. You know the solution? His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of skepticism, of decades in academia where claims required proof. Anna swallowed hard. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to mutter an apology, to vanish, but something inside her, a quiet defiance, a buried confidence, held her ground. "Yes," she said, barely louder than a whisper, but steady. A ripple moved through the students. Some chuckled nervously. Others exchanged looks of disbelief. Emily's eyes widened in both awe and confusion. Jason shifted in his seat, guilt from the spill forgotten. For the first time that day, the equation on the board wasn't the only mystery in the room, and just like that, the janitor had become the center of the story. For a heartbeat, the room was still. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint drip of water from some leaky pipe above, and then Anna's words hung there, suspended like smoke. I know the solution. At first, no one moved. The students sat frozen in disbelief, their faces a mix of confusion and ridicule, like spectators at a circus unsure if the act was a joke. Emily's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jason blinked rapidly, his brain refusing to compute what he'd heard. Mark let out a nervous laugh, the kind that masks fear. Sophia gripped the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. A janitor, claiming she could solve this. Professor Robert Miller stood at the front, his chalk hovering midair. He was a man who had spent decades drowning in numbers, a man revered and sometimes feared for his intellectual precision, and yet his eyes didn't carry scorn, only a flicker of something else, curiosity. He lowered the chalk, slowly, deliberately. "Come again?" His voice cut through the silence. Anna swallowed. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing, but the fire in her mind was too sharp, the solution too alive to be denied. "I said," she straightened, though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, "I know the solution." The words landed heavier this time, carrying weight, the kind of weight that shifted the air itself. Mark scoffed, whispering to Jason, "She doesn't even belong here. What's she talking about?" Jason shrugged, though his wide eyes betrayed his nerves. Emily, however, leaned forward slightly, unable to look away. Miller studied Anna with unnerving calm. Then, to the shock of everyone, he extended his hand, holding out the chalk like an offering. "Show us." The gasp that followed was almost physical. Emily clapped a hand over her mouth. Sophia shook her head in disbelief. "Professor, you can't be serious," she whispered under her breath. But he was. He didn't break an eye contact with Anna. His expression wasn't mocking, nor indulgent. It was the look of a man who had seen too much of the world to dismiss miracles outright. Anna froze. Her knees threatened to buckle. The chalk seemed impossibly far, as if crossing the room meant crossing into another life entirely. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in front of these students, not beside this professor. She was supposed to remain invisible, sweeping up their crumbs, erasing their accidents. But her mind blazed with clarity. Every line on that board wasn't chaos. It was a path, and the path was hers to walk. She stepped forward. The shuffle of her shoes echoed louder than it should have. The students tracked her every move, their stares sharp, dissecting, doubtful. Jason muttered, "This is insane." Mark leaned back, arms crossed, ready to watch her fail. Yet Anna didn't falter. She reached the front, standing face to face with Miller. The chalk was in his outstretched hand, waiting. For a moment, their eyes locked. Professor and janitor, two worlds colliding. Then she took it. The chalk was cold, almost brittle in her fingers. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Behind her, whispers crackled like static. Does she really think she can do this? She'll embarrass herself. Why is the professor letting this happen? Anna blocked it all out. She turned to the board, and there it was, the sprawling nightmare of symbols that had strangled the class for nearly an hour. She didn't see chaos. She saw structure. She saw doors waiting to be opened, threads waiting to be pulled. Her lips curved, not a smile of arrogance, but of recognition, like meeting an old friend you never realized you missed. She raised the chalk. The sound was sharp as it touched the board. Every eye in the room locked on her. Miller folded his arms, watching, silent. The faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. Anna drew the first line, then another. Her movements were precise, confident, as though she'd been preparing her whole life for this very moment. Behind her, Emily leaned forward so far she nearly toppled from her seat. Jason's jaw slackened. Mark's smirk faltered, replaced by uncertainty. Sophia whispered, "Oh my God." In less than a minute, the board began to transform. What had been a labyrinth of confusion was becoming, under Anna's hand, a map, a sequence, a story unfolding step by step. The janitor was solving the unsolvable, and as each symbol fell into place, the silence of disbelief deepened until it became something else entirely, reverence. For the first time, the students weren't staring at the board in despair. They were staring at Anna, and no one could look away. The first stroke of chalk was hesitant, almost shy, but by the second, it wasn't hesitation anymore. It was rhythm. Anna's hand moved with a kind of certainty that didn't belong to someone who claimed she wasn't supposed to be here. Each line she drew seemed to slice through the suffocating fog of confusion that had wrapped the room for nearly an hour. For the students, it was like watching the impossible. Emily leaned forward, whispering under her breath, She knows exactly what she's doing." Beside her, Mark's smirk faltered. "No way, he muttered. Though his eyes betrayed him, they couldn't look away. Jason, who had caused the orange juice disaster minutes earlier, now sat frozen, guilt forgotten, his entire focus locked on Anna's movements. Sophia clutched her pen so tightly it threatened to snap, her disbelief battling with awe. The chalk clicked against the board in rapid succession, symbols connected, fractions collapsed, angles aligned. It was as if the nightmare equation that had mocked the students for so long was finally surrendering to her. Anna didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Her breathing was steady, her strokes deliberate. Every number she wrote had a purpose, every symbol a destination. It wasn't frantic. It was choreography. It was music. Behind her, the murmurs began. She's actually solving it. Look at that step. It makes sense. God, how did we not see that? Emily leaned toward Mark, her voice shaking. This isn't luck. She's following a structure. It's clean. It's beautiful. Mark swallowed a wet, his pride evaporating. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. Anna moved across the board with quiet command, the chalk dust smearing her fingertips, the symbols forming a cascade of logic that unfolded like a story. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. This wasn't some accidental flash of insight. This was mastery. Professor Robert Miller stood with arms crossed, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in concentration. He watched her every move, recognizing the elegance in her method. He had spent his career among geniuses, had taught some of the brightest minds of the century, and here, in this moment, a woman society dismissed as the janitor was demonstrating a brilliance that rivaled them all. Minutes passed. The silence thickened, broken only by the sound of chalk against slate. 10 minutes felt like an eternity and a blink all at once. Then, it happened. Anna placed the chalk down, slowly. She stepped aside, her face calm, her breathing even. The board behind her was no longer a battlefield of confusion, but a cathedral of order. Every line, every number, in harmony. The final answer gleamed at the bottom, stark and undeniable. The room held its breath. Emily was the first to react. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "She did it," she whispered, voice trembling. Jason let out a laugh, short, disbelieving, almost hysterical. "Holy crap, she actually did it." Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears she didn't understand. She shook her head slowly. I've never seen anything like that." Even Mark, usually arrogant and dismissive, could only sit in silence. His eyes flicked from the board to Anna and back again, the weight of his disbelief cracking under the truth. And then, applause. It started as a single clap, then another, and another. Soon, the entire room erupted into thunderous applause, the kind that shook the walls, that carried more weight than any lecture ever had. Students rose to their feet, their faces alight with awe, clapping not just for the solution, but for the revelation of who had delivered it. Anna lowered her gaze, her lips curving into the faintest, humblest of smiles. She didn't bask in the glory. She didn't raise her arms in triumph. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the storm of admiration with quiet dignity. At the front, Professor Miller finally spoke. His voice was softer than before, but it carried the kind of respect no student had ever heard from him. Remarkable, he said. His eyes locked on Anna. Truly remarkable. He gave the slightest nod, a gesture that in his world of intellect was equivalent to a standing ovation. The applause swelled again, echoing down the hallways outside the classroom. People who passed by stopped, peering in, wondering what miracle had taken place inside. And in that moment, Anna Thompson, the woman who came in with a mop and a rag, was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. The applause rolled through the lecture hall like thunder, wave after wave crashing against the walls and ceiling until the very air seemed to tremble. It wasn't the tidy, courtois, courteous clapping reserved for visiting lecturers or polite conclusions. It was raw, unrestrained. The kind of ovation that bursts from people when they've just witnessed something they can't quite explain. The sound had a life of its own, growing louder as though every pair of hands refused to be outdone by the others. Students who only minutes earlier had been slumped in their seats, eyes glazed and spirits broken by equations that seemed carved from another universe, now stood tall, their faces flushed, their hands burning from the ferocity of their applause. They weren't cheering for a neat answer written in chalk. They weren't celebrating a formula memorized from a book. They were cheering for revelation, for a truth that had cracked open the ceiling of their limitations and let light pour in. And at the center of it all stood Anna Thompson. She did not play to the crowd. She didn't throw her arms in the air like a victorious athlete, didn't bow with theatrical flair, didn't bask in triumph. Instead, she let the chalk dust fall from her fingertips, lowering her gaze as if the numbers and symbols on the board had been the true stars of the evening. A soft, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across her lips, a smile that said, "This was never about me. It was about the truth waiting to be seen." The ovation thundered around her, yet Anna seemed untouched, almost serene, as if the clamor of admiration were nothing more than rain sliding across a rooftop. Then, with the same quiet grace with which she had entered, she stepped back. At the far end of the hall, the double doors loomed. She began walking toward them, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the steady pace of someone crossing an invisible bridge, leaving one world behind and stepping into another. The roar of the crowd swelled again, but she never once looked back. Each footstep echoed against the marble floor, measured and deliberate. The students parted instinctively, as though she were royalty or a prophet, clearing a path without a word. Some whispered her name in awe, others simply stared, wide-eyed, their reverence written plainly on their faces. Jason, the nervous young man whose clumsy elbow had accidentally tipped his juice onto the professor's notes and set this whole chain of events into motion, felt a lump in his throat that words could not dislodge. He wanted desperately to thank her, to apologize, to say anything, but his voice failed him. Emily, hands clasped as though in prayer, followed Anna with her eyes as one might follow a comet streaking across a dark sky. Knowing such brilliance comes rarely and passes quickly. Even Mark, the skeptic, the cynic who had scoffed at the very idea that the equation could be solved, found himself standing straighter, stripped of arrogance, humbled in a way he hadn't known was possible. When Anna reached the doorway, she paused, just for a heartbeat. The applause still shook the hall, but in that single pause, time itself seemed to hold its breath. She turned her head ever so slightly, offering a final nod, not one of pride or superiority, but of acknowledgement. It was as if she were telling them without words, "You, too, are capable. You just haven't seen it yet." And then she was gone. The silence that followed her exit was unlike any silence before. The clapping had ended, but its echo remained lodged in their bones, vibrating in their hearts. Chalk dust still hung in the air like the remnants of a storm, and the blackboard, crowded with her sprawling solution, stood like a monument, a testament to possibility. Even Professor Robert Miller, a man whose entire career had been built on certainty and control, remained frozen in place, his gaze fixed on the door long after she had vanished. At last, His voice broke the stillness. "You will remember this day," he said quietly, though every corner of the hall seemed to carry his words. "Not because of the equation, not because of me, but because wisdom often wears the plainest clothes. Genius does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it carries a mop." The words sank deep, leaving the students stunned, their minds spinning with what they had just witnessed. That night, the story spread across campus like wildfire. By morning, it had already morphed into legend. The janitor who solved the unsolvable. Whispers of her name traveled through dorm hallways, spilled across cafeteria tables, and echoed in faculty offices. Some dismissed it as rumor, an embellished tale fueled by caffeine and youthful imagination. But those who had been in the lecture hall knew better. They had seen, they had felt, and the memory branded itself onto their lives. In the weeks that followed, Anna could no longer drift unseen through the campus. Whenever she wheeled her cart and mop across the linoleum floors, the air shifted. Students who once hurried past her as though she were part of the scenery now slowed their pace. Some straightened their backs and offered greetings. Others, awkward with nerves, bowed their heads in quiet respect. "Good morning, Ms. Thompson." "Hello, Anna. Thank you for everything." She would smile back, sometimes a nod, sometimes a soft "good morning" in return, but she never lingered. She emptied trash bins, polished glass doors, scrubbed chalkboards, and returned to her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet to the students, she was no longer invisible. One evening, Emily spotted Anna sitting alone on a bench near the quad, her mop propped beside her, the sunset painting the sky behind her in bands of violet and gold. Emily hesitated, her courage caught in her throat before finally approaching. "Ms. Thompson?" she asked. Anna turned, her expression calm, welcoming. I wanted to thank you." Emily stammered. "For what you did that day. You showed me something I didn't think was possible. You showed me that brilliance doesn't always come from where people expect." Anna studied her for a moment, then placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "Remember this," she said softly. "Knowledge isn't about titles or diplomas. It's about how you see the world. Don't ever let anyone draw a line around your potential." Emily nodded, her eyes glassy, her heart swelling with the conviction she would carry for the rest of her life. Others had their own moments. Jason, still burdened with guilt for the accident that had drawn Anna into the lecture hall, once stopped her in a hallway. "I'm sorry," he blurted. Anna raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For making the mess. For dragging you into that room. If I hadn't—" She smiled. "Then none of us would have discovered what we did." Jason blinked, stunned. In that moment, he realized her wisdom wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about uncovering the opportunities hidden within them. Even Mark, too proud to offer an apology, found himself changed. One afternoon, he handed her a notebook filled with equations. "I wanted to try to see if I could think the way you did. Could you maybe look at this? Tell me if I'm on the right track?" Anna leafed through the pages, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're closer than you think," she said. And with that, years of arrogance in Mark's chest collapsed into humility. The ripple reached even the faculty. Professor Miller, usually a bastion of composure, began greeting her with a nod whenever their paths crossed. Once, he even paused while she was cleaning his office. "I've taught for 3 decades, he admitted quietly. "But you reminded me that teaching is only half of wisdom. The other half is remembering that brilliance can bloom anywhere." And bloom it did. Months later, when the graduating class crossed the stage in their caps and gowns, many of them turned their heads toward the side of the auditorium, where Anna stood quietly with her mop and cart. One by one, as they took their diplomas, they offered her a smile, a nod, a silent acknowledgement that she, born too, had shaped their education. Her story became something more than rumor. It became a parable, a quiet revolution. Professors told it to new students. Seniors whispered it to freshmen. Cafes buzzed with retellings. It drifted off campus and into the wider world, folded into stories of perseverance, humility, and the reminder that brilliance often hides where no one bothers to look. Anna never sought recognition. She never demanded acknowledgement or tried to seize her legend, but she became a symbol, a living reminder that genius can wear work shoes, push a mop, and still leave footprints on the world. And though she always slipped away quietly, returning to her duties without fanfare, her presence lingered in every corridor, every classroom, every student who believed again in possibility. Her footsteps may have been silent, but the echo of her truth would never fade. The classroom never returned to what it had been before that day. The chalkboard, once covered with hurried scribbles and half-finished equations, was wiped clean a few days later. The chalk dust was swept into the corners, forgotten by the janitor's broom, and the desks were rearranged for the next lesson as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the memory lingered, stronger than any calculation or formula, etched deeper into the minds of those who had witnessed it than any line of numbers ever could. Because what Anna Thompson proved in that moment wasn't simply a clever solution to a mathematical problem. It was something far greater, something that struck at the heart of human pride. She exposed arrogance for what it was, a fragile mask. She shattered blindness, the kind that comes not from failing to see, but from refusing to notice. And above all, she revealed the danger of underestimating someone simply because they appear ordinary. Her story endures as a reminder, one that should echo in every hallway and lecture hall. Brilliance does not always arrive with certificates or letters after a name. Genius isn't always wrapped in a tailored suit, armed with polished speeches, or positioned at the front of a room where everyone is forced to look. Sometimes, true genius walks in unnoticed. Sometimes, it wears work shoes instead of leather ones, carries a mop instead of a textbook, and sees clearly the patterns that those trained to know better overlook. Anna's act was simple, but its message was profound. She showed that knowledge and creativity often spark in places where we least expect them. From the hands of those dismissed as background figures, from the voices ignored too quickly, wisdom emerges, quiet, unpolished, yet undeniable. The extraordinary, more often than not, hides inside the ordinary, waiting for someone with courage enough to reveal it. So remember this: never underestimate anyone. The custodian, the cashier, the shy student sitting in the back row, the person you pass on the street without a second thought. They may carry insights that could change the way you see the world. Respect them, listen to them, because greatness does not belong to a select few. It belongs to anyone who dares to think differently. And now make my friends. If this story stirred something in you, if it challenged the way you measure worth, if it reminded you to look beyond appearances and titles, if it encouraged you to honor the wisdom that often hides in silence, then let it not end here. Carry it with you. Share it. Let it shape the way you treat others. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with grand speeches, but with the quiet voice of someone the world almost forgot. Stories like Anna's remind us that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. If this touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring everyday stories. Stay tuned.